resurrected, and we can move and have peace for Israel, which has been one of my prayers for more than 30 years, and peace for their neighbors as well. I just got back from China, and my concern is that there's an element of antagonism that is building between the United States and China, which could degenerate into a very serious confrontation. I hope that will change, because when I left office, we had just normalized diplomatic relations with China, and that's another concern. I think there's going to be now a movement on immigration, which I've just pointed out. I noticed he mentioned global warming and environment. That's another thing we need to move forward to attend to. So he has a big agenda ahead of him, and very serious problems in several countries in the world. But I think his movement out of war, as he said, after ending a decade, as a matter of fact, more than a decade of war, into an element of peace. I hope that peace will prevail.
Thank you so much, Mr. President. Enjoy the lunch. I heard it's pretty tasty.
That's what I heard.
Okay, thank you so much.
Bison, as a matter of fact.
That's right. Thank you. Back to you, Anderson.
You see the Supreme Court Justice Scalia there. Now you see Senator John Kerry. We just saw President Barack Obama signing the papers for him to be nominated to Secretary of State. Let's check in with Robin Meade, who's down the National Mall. Robin?
Yeah, if you're on the National Mall like these folks were, I wanted to see how the speech resonated with them. They want to get a cheer in first. And I told them they could, as long as we could hear Stephanie Jessup. She's from Indianapolis. And you said there was a part of the speech that really resonated with you.
Yes, it was a very emotional moment, but the best part was the president calling us to unite as a nation. Unite as a nation. It was wonderful.
Okay, how about you, Gwen, over here?
You know, he just talked about how we're such a resilient nation. And I just thought, you know, I live in New Jersey, so we just did the Sandy storm. Yeah. And, you know, a lot of my friends, their houses got swept away. So, you know, he was saying, hey, you know, even though we can be at our lowest point, we're a nation that always comes back, and we stand at the forefront. So to me, that was the big thing. You know, we really need to focus on that.
Gwen, thank you. So unity seemed to be a lot of the message that really resonated with the crowd here. Anderson.
Robin, thanks very much. Obviously, the tragedy in Newtown is something that has resonated very deeply with this president. He made reference to it in his speech. Let's listen to that part of the inaugural address.
Our journey is not complete until all our children, from the streets of Detroit to the hills of Appalachia to the quiet lanes of Newtown, know that they are cared for and cherished and always safe from harm.
David Moranis, this is clearly something the president was extraordinarily moved by and continues to be.
I think that Newtown changed Obama. And I think that when he said that was the most difficult day of his presidency, I think there was a level of remorse, actually, of guilt that he had not moved more on gun control in the first term. And that gave him that sort of sense of passion and resolve that really helped transform him. I think you could feel it today.
He also talked to, several days ago, talked about the family of Grace McDonald, who was killed in Newtown. Grace's father, Chris, gave him a picture of an owl that Grace had drawn, which he's framed and has put in his private study right off the Oval Office.
You know, presidents sometimes keep these things to remind them of what they were sent to office to do. And the picture hanging on the wall is important because, as you heard former President Jimmy Carter say to Dana Bash, some of gun control will get through. Sometimes you need those things to remind you that you have to push and you have to continue to push. And I think that's what we heard in the speech today, actually. A push on equality, a push on principle, and then an action agenda, which we heard detailed in this speech.
If you look at any one of the controversial things, talking about making further advances in gay rights, again, groundbreaking advances for Western civilization, it's hard to argue with that. Certainly for the President of the United States, it's a heavy lift. Gun control, a heavy lift. Immigration reform, a heavy lift. Climate change, a heavy lift. Immigration and climate change are on the first term list, and President Carter just alluded to it. The President didn't really fight for them because there was such political risk. Now he has a second 4 years, and a second-term president faces fundamental choices. Do you try to do all the hard things, and you might fail? And what does that say about your legacy? or do you just pick a couple of things to add to your basket? Today, he made the case that he's going to try on some pretty heavy lifts. And if we judge him in a year or two by what he said today, this is a pretty substantial. Again, we need to see the specifics. And he also made clear you need to compromise. No one man can do these things, he said. So he's not saying my way or the highway, but he's saying this is my list, and I'm going to stay at it. And it'll be a fascinating test to see 6 months and a year from now, because these are not small, politically inconsequential items.
And you mentioned 6 months or a year. He has a short window. It's not large. You know, second-term presidents have to get things done before their first midterm election. You know, they have maybe a year, 18 months.
He acknowledged it in a way. You know, he said twice, we are made for this moment and we will seize it.
Right.
He said, we will make progress. It requires us to act in our time. So this speech was about for the centuries, for the future, by talking about equality, but there was also a measure of recognizing he has to act now.
Well, some of the issues which you talked about, equality, particularly on equal rights for gay and lesbian Americans, are not things which necessarily he can do, but which the Supreme Court may be ruling on. Jeffrey Toobin is joining us right now, our senior legal analyst. Jeffrey, obviously two major Supreme Court rulings to be coming up on the so-called Defense of Marriage Act and also Proposition 8.
Well, and you know, as you noticed, I mean, this incredibly strong embrace of gay rights in the speech, where he put Stonewall in the same category with Seneca Falls and Selma, standing right beside the Supreme Court that will consider these issues. And remember, this is a president who's, when his parents got married in Hawaii, their marriage was a crime in 19 states. You know, interracial marriage was still constitutionally allowed. There was no prohibition against those sorts of laws. It wasn't until 1967 that the Supreme Court said states could no longer ban racial intermarriage. That case for gay rights, potentially, is before the Supreme Court. It's going to be argued in March, and the parallel there is really quite striking.
Alex Castellanos, from a Republican standpoint, did the president reach out enough, you think, to the opposition, to his opposition in Washington?
I think that's the issue that Republicans will have. As we started to say, this is not a speech that John F. Kennedy might have given to inspire folks to, let's go on a great mission together. This was the speech of a warrior. This was an FDR type of speech. As a matter of fact, you know, when FDR in his second inaugural said, our problem is social justice. Our problem is not more for those who already have much. It's getting enough for those who have so little. When we take care of that problem, we can move forward as a country. Barack Obama echoed that today. He said things like our country cannot succeed when a shrinking few do very well and a growing many barely make it. Echoes of FDR, a fighting president who also had a long-term stagnant economy. This was a guy who's ready to go to combat, and he said, look, your votes were great, but I now need your voices.
Alex brings up history. Let's check in with H.W. Brands, a history professor and author from the University of Texas. I'm curious about your viewpoint on this speech from a historical perspective.
A couple of things. I was struck by the comparatively combative tone that the president took. It was really clear that he's not backing down from the fact that he won the election and he's going to govern as though he won. He made a reference to the fact that he and other people took the oath of office to God and country and not to parties. And he deliberately tried to reach over the heads of Congress and heads of his opposition by repeatedly calling to the people, referring to fellow citizens, we needed this. I think perhaps the most important part of the speech is one that's gone comparatively unremarked so far, and that is his rebuke to his predecessors for what he called the decade of war, and his belief that the United States does not have to pursue a policy of what he called perpetual war. Instead, that the pursuit of war can be replaced by the pursuit of peace. The reason I think this might be the most significant is that it's probably one aspect of the agenda he laid out he'll actually be able to do, because presidents in their second term very often turn to foreign affairs because it's the one in which they exercise the greatest initiative. Nearly everything else that was laid out, he's going to have to get the cooperation of Congress. But to change American foreign policy, he can do that pretty much by himself.
His team he's appointing reflects that view. Senator Hagel, a Vietnam veteran at the Defense Department who said that building has to be downsized, has been very skeptical of drawing a very hard line before you shed American blood. Senator Kerry, another Vietnam veteran who has been very skeptical. So the professor makes a key point, I think, about the president's worldview being more cautious than his predecessors. I want to make one other point on the gay rights question. If you look historically, for major movements in any of these big questions, women's rights, civil rights, someone in a leadership position who for a long time has been saying no has to say yes to bring the movement along. It was the old bulls in the Senate and the civil rights movement, for example. President Obama was a no when he took office on these questions. And that was one of the areas where fellow progressives frowned on him, did not like the fact that he was a no. He said he was skeptical. He said his own religious upbringing. And Van was talking earlier, as we listened to the quiet dignity of John Lewis, a lot of the civil rights movement has a lot of its base in the African-American church. A lot of those ministers said no to these questions. Some of them still say no, but a lot fewer today than a few years ago.
I don't think in his heart he ever really said no. I think that was a political calculation, and also one about bringing people along. He's always trying to avoid the traps, and I think that he was waiting to get to that moment.
Let's check in with Dana Bash, where the president is about to, I think, pass by her again. Dana?
That's right, Anderson. We're standing again in the Capitol Rotunda. Right over behind me is where Statuary Hall is. That is where you see the pictures right there of John Kerry and other senators inside waiting for the president. And we're, in fact, waiting for the president ourselves. He should walk by us pretty much any minute. You saw him earlier doing some official signing some important things, like officially nominating some new members he hopes will be new members of his cabinet. And so we're waiting for him to walk by here and go into this lunch. One interesting little anecdote is that, and I mentioned this earlier in our programming, but I think it's worth repeating, that 4 years ago, the president, according to the Senate curator who watched him during most of the lunch, he didn't eat. He instead was kind of walking around from table to table, greeting people, socializing, which is kind of ironic now because over the past 4 years, especially over the past maybe few months, when things have gotten really, really intensely partisan here, the president's been criticized for not socializing enough, not reaching out enough. So we'll see if he does the same thing at this lunch, if he sits down and eats and keeps to himself, or he actually goes around the room and shakes hands with all of the Democrats and Republicans and Supreme Court justices and other members of the exclusive guest list that are going to be at this lunch.
Yeah, Dana, talk about this lunch. I mean, who is it? Who's invited? Here's the president and the vice president. Vice president entering the room. Dana, who is invited to this lunch? It's not all members of the Senate.
Not at all. 220 tickets, that's all. So some of the most senior members of the Senate are invited, the leadership of the House and the Senate, some of the most senior members of the House, select members of the House. Also, as I said, members of the Supreme Court, the Joint Chiefs are invited. Sorry, I'm looking up. You know what, I'm going to... Just looking over here because I believe the president is about to walk by. I see his official photographer, so he should come any minute. And here they come. Here comes President Obama and Mrs. Obama going into their lunch.
In Washington, in the Congress.
And you see that he is escorted, Anderson, by some of the Senate folks who really keep the Senate running, like the Sergeant-at-Arms, but also Senator Chuck Schumer, who you saw MC the earlier ceremony. He's the chairman of the Inaugural Committee. He's going to be with him all day. Let's listen.
No, I can do it for a moment.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States, Barack H. Obama, and Mrs. Obama, accompanied by Senator Charles E. Schumer and Mrs. Schumer.
And Dan, I know Senator Schumer from New York, who organized this luncheon, was responsible for the menu. He wanted to make sure most of the items on the menu were from New York. I think they're apples from upstate New York. I understand he tried to get Long Island duck, but instead they've ended up with bison from out of state.
That's right. The reason that happened is because they actually have this very interesting tradition where the spouses of the members of the Joint Inaugural Committee actually do a tasting, and they tasted the duck, and they said, according to Schumer, it just was kind of gross.